Over 80 miles offshore, a lone golden Labrador swims through deathly silence. No boat, no life jacket, no chance. Until a grieving woman mourning a child she'll never hold again sees what no one else would. Both adrift, both broken. But fate has a way of pulling lost souls together when they need each other most. Where the waves couldn't drown hope. The sea doesn't hide secrets. It simply swallows them whole. That morning, Rachel Morgan wanted nothing more than to photograph stillness to escape the storm inside her. But far across the silver water, she saw a flicker. Small, desperate, impossible. A pale yellow Labrador, fighting to stay afloat where no life should remain. And in that moment, she knew she couldn't look away. The wind that morning over the Oregon coast was listless and gray, dragging low clouds across the sky like mourning veils. A hush had settled over the coastal town of Dunebrook, a quiet fishing village 2 hours south of Newport, where the sea met land with a weary sigh rather than a roar. Summer was fading, but the air still carried a strange warmth, wrapped in the salt and silence of early September. Rachel Morgan, 38, stood alone at the bow of a modest rental fishing boat, her hands trembling slightly around the weathered lens of her Canon. She was tall, with a lean frame made angular by stress and solitude. Her once rich auburn hair was tucked into a loose braid beneath a navy beanie. Those strands had broken free to dance in the breeze. Her face bore the soft, unfinished sadness of someone learning how to live again after forgetting. 3 years ago, she had lost her only child, Caleb, to a rare and sudden illness that had robbed her of color, sleep, and purpose. In the time since, she'd wandered along the edges of the world with her camera, chasing beauty in places too quiet for grief to echo. She hadn't expected much from that mornina, few photos of pelicans perhaps, or the drifting shapes of sea lions near the cliffs. But the sea had other plans. She first noticed the movement around 9:17 a.m., a faint bob in the far distance, just past the jagged outline of Red Gull Point. At first glance, it looked like driftwood, smooth and rolling with the current. But something about the way it struggled against the tide caught her eye, how it didn't glide, but flailed. Rachel lifted her camera instinctively and zoomed in. The lens trembled. It wasn't wood. Her heart stumbled. Through the frame, she saw a doga yellow Labrador, far too far from land, paddling weakly in open water. His fur was slick with salt and clung to his narrow body. His ears flattened every time a wave passed, and his eyes, barely above the waterline, held a dull desperation that pierced through the lens and into her bones. There was no boat in sight, no collar around his neck, no sign of a human anywhere, just the endless slate-gray ocean and this creature clinging to life in its center. Rachel dropped the camera, heart racing. "Oh God," she whispered, scrambling to turn the boat. The outboard engine coughed once, then rumbled to life, cutting across the flat water. As she neared, she could see him more clearly. He was not old, maybe 4 years at most, though the sea had aged him cruelly. His coat, a pale, buttery yellow, was matted and tangled with seaweed. His front legs paddled out of instinct, not strength, and his head dipped with every third wave, resurfacing slower each time. She shouted, "Hang on, buddy! I see you!" But he didn't react. His body had gone limp in the shoulders, his mouth just above the brine, eyes unfocused. Rachel didn't think. She never did when it mattered. She kicked off her boots, stripped off her jacket, and dove in. The water swallowed her like a gasp, colder than she'd expected, darker too. Her limbs fought the shock, but her eyes never left him. He was barely 10 feet away now. She powered through, breath ragged, until her hand brushed against his sodden fur. He didn't resist. He simply sagged into her arms like driftwood, heavy and yielding. She wrapped one arm around his chest, the other beneath his hindquarters, and began the brutal swim back. Each kick was agony. The weight of him was not just physical, it was the weight of every loss she had never been able to save. By the time they reached the boat's stern, she was gasping, clinging to the ladder with one hand. She pushed from beneath as best she could, urging him upward. He clawed instinctively, scraping the aluminum with raw pads, until finally he collapsed onto the deck with a wet thud. Rachel followed moments later, soaked to the bone, chest heaving. She lay beside him, staring at the sky. The dog didn't move, but then faintly his chest rose. Then again, a steady, shallow rhythm. "You're alive," she whispered, brushing the wet fur from his face. His eyes blinked slowly. Not recognition, not trust, just a flicker. Enough. Rachel reached for the emergency tarp beneath the bench seat and wrapped it around him. The boat rocked gently beneath them, a cradle in the middle of nowhere. Above, a few seabirds circled in lazy arcs. Rachel sat against the railing, clutching the dog to her side, water dripping from her sleeves. She didn't know who he was, or how he'd gotten there. But something inside her shifted. An old ache she thought had sealed shut stirred again. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something neither of them had planned. The road back from the dock was rough and cracked, hemmed in by whispering pine trees and the silent judgment of the sky. Rachel Morgan drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting gently on the blanket-wrapped body beside her on the passenger seat. The Labrador had not made a sound since they'd left the water. His eyes were closed, breath still shallow but steady, as if suspended in a sleep just beyond reach. The truck smelled like salt and wet fur, but Rachel didn't mind. Every few minutes, she glanced sideways to confirm he was still breathing. Her cabin sat at the edge of Wren Hollow, a rural sliver of Oregon that didn't show up on many maps. It was the kind of place where phones lost signal, neighbors stayed a respectful half-mile apart, and the sound of the wind through the trees could drown out even the loudest thoughts. The structure itself was humble 12 rooms, cedar siding, a chimney scarred by weather, but to Rachel, it was the last place she could bear to be. It had belonged to her parents, then sat vacant for years before she moved back. She hadn't changed much about it, except to clear out the guest room where Caleb's things had once been stored. She parked by the porch and turned off the ignition. The sudden silence made her ears ring. Carefully, she reached over and gathered the dog in her arms again. He was heavier now that her adrenaline had faded, but she carried him anyway through the front door, down the hallway, and into the warmest corner of the cabin near the old iron stove. She laid him on a folded quilt and tucked another blanket over his body. By the time she called the vet, the dog was breathing more evenly. Dr. Mark Lawson arrived 20 minutes later in a dusty red Subaru, carrying a worn medical kit and the scent of peppermint tobacco. He was in his early 50s, with tanned skin, thin glasses, and a white beard that added kindness to a face already lined with patience. A lifelong resident of Wren Hollow, Dr. Lawson was one of those people whose voice you trusted the moment you heard it, low, gentle, and measured like a father telling bedtime stories. Rachel opened the door before he could knock. "He's by the stove," she said, voice still hoarse from the salt water. Mark knelt beside the dog without needing instruction. "Well now," he murmured, brushing back the fur on the dog's neck. "You've had one hell of a day, haven't you, big guy?" He examined him slowly, checking his paws, ears, gums, heart. The Labrador flinched once but didn't resist. His eyes opened briefly, flickering with that same distant focus Rachel had seen on the boat. "He's young," Mark said after a moment. 4, maybe 5. Male, unneutered. Severe dehydration, borderline hypothermia, and judging by these abrasions on his belly and leg, she's been in the water a long time, at least 6 hours. Maybe more. "Any ID?" Rachel asked. Mark shook his head. "No collar, no microchip, no tattoo. Nothing." He sighed. If I had to guess, I'd say he was dumped, but not locally. No dog survives a swim like that by accident. Rachel didn't respond. She simply sat down beside the dog, resting a hand gently on his side. I pulled him out 50 miles off the coast. No boats nearby. Nothing. Mark's brow furrowed deeply. Jesus? And he was still swimming? She nodded. He gave her a long look, then stood. Keep him warm and hydrated. Don't force food. Yeth needs rest more than anything. If he makes it through the night, he'll likely recover. But it'll take time. Rachel walked him out to the porch. The doctor paused at the steps, then turned. You giving him a name? She hesitated. Not yet. Doesn't feel right. Maybe he'll tell you, Mark said with a soft smile, then got into his car and drove away. That night, as rain tapped softly on the tin roof, Rachel lay on the worn couch facing the stove. The Labrador hadn't moved much. His eyes would flutter open, then close again. Once, he shifted to face the fire, his nose twitching faintly. Rachel whispered stories to him in the dark, not real ones, just fragments of memory. Her voice cracked when she mentioned Caleb. She hadn't said his name aloud in over a year. Somewhere around 3 a.m., sleep finally claimed her. And that's when the dream came. In it, the cabin was bright. Summer streamed through the windows. A child's laugh echoed off the walls, sharp and clean. She turned in the dream to see Caleb Kalebno, older than 5, standing in the hallway. His curls were damp from swimming. He was barefoot, his cheeks sun-warmed and glowing. He smiled at her, eyes wide with joy. "Mom," he called softly, turning toward the fireplace. "Cooper's home." She followed his gaze. The Labrador was there, tail wagging gently, looking whole and golden and clean. Rachel woke with a start, tears drying on her cheeks. The dog stirred. Slowly, stiffly, he lifted his head and looked at her. "Cooper," she said aloud, almost afraid the name would break the silence. The dog blinked, then lay his head back down, eyes still on her. She didn't know why the name fit, but it did, and it was his now. By the 3rd day, the rain had cleared. The sky above Wren Hollow opened up in streaks of pale gold and cotton white, and the air smelled like pine needles and something quietly hopeful. The forest behind Rachel Morgan's cabin breathed with soft birdsong and distant rustling. Inside, the Labrador was beginning to stand. His movements were slow, deliberate, and strangely precise, not clumsy, like most dogs recovering from trauma. Each time he shifted his weight or adjusted his position on the quilt by the stove, Rachel noticed something unusual in the way he moved. Economical, silent, alert. He was no longer just surviving, he was observing. Rachel sat across the room, coffee in hand, barefoot in worn flannel pajamas. She hadn't said much to Cooper that morning, just a few quiet words and offers of water. But what caught her attention was the way he responded to small sounds. Not startled, not timid, just aware. When the kettle clicked off, he didn't flinch. When the floorboard creaked beneath her feet, his eyes tracked her calmly but without alarm. And when she dropped a spoon by accident, he simply turned his head, registering the noise with a flick of an ear before returning to stillness. It was how her late husband Lucas used to move during his time in the Marinus, calculated, trained, efficient. After breakfast, she decided to test something. She stepped into the middle of the room, set her mug down, and said firmly, "Sit." No reaction. Then, without speaking, she raised her hand flat, palm forward, then slowly lowered it. Cooper sat immediately. Rachel blinked. She tried again, this time 2 fingers raised, a slight curl in the wrist, a gesture she remembered Lucas using while training military dogs on base. Cooper dropped into a low crouch, his ears still, eyes locked on hers. Her breath caught. She didn't know much about advanced canine training, but this wasn't instinct. It was protocol, discipline. She needed help. Rachel dug her old cell phone from the junk drawer and found the number she hadn't dialed in 3 years. Sharon Whitaker answered on the second ring. "Well, hell," came the warm, familiar drawl. "Either someone died, or you saw a ghost. Which is it?" Rachel smiled despite herself. "Neither. But I found something, or maybe someone." Sharon had been her closest friend during the hardest years. A tough, no-nonsense woman in her early 60s, with a wild mane of silver blonde curls and the straight-backed posture of someone who had spent most of her life commanding respect in a room full of soldiers. After 20 years with the military's Tactical Canine Division, Sharon retired to a horse ranch just outside Medford, Oregon, where she spent her days breaking Mustangs and brewing whiskey from scratch. Rachel gave her a brief overview, skipping the dream but mentioning the rescue, the lack of ID, and the strange responses to silent commands. "I'm coming tomorrow," Sharon said without hesitation. "That dog's not just lucky. He's trained." The next afternoon, Sharon pulled up in a dusty black pickup, wearing boots caked in red dirt and a faded ball cap that read, "Retired, not dead." She stepped out, tall and broad, shouldered, her denim jacket open over a flannel shirt and a leather belt lined with old brass buckles, her eyes gray and sharp-took in the cabin, and Rachel's worried posture in a single glance. "Where is he?" she asked. Rachel gestured inside. Cooper was lying on the porch now, eyes half closed but alert. As Sharon approached, he stood slowly, legs slightly stiff but balanced, his gaze locked onto hers. Sharon stopped 5 feet away and crouched. She didn't reach out. "Let's see what you remember," she murmured. Then in a low, steady voice, "Stay." Cooper froze. She gave 3 subtle hand signal zones Rachel didn't recognize, and with each, Cooper responded immediately. Sit, crawl, pivot. Sharon stood slowly. "He's a ghost," she said, voice quieter now. "They usually don't survive long enough to be found. But this one? He didn't just survive, he escaped." Rachel's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "There are only a few units in the country that train dogs like this tactical response. 9s, high-level operations. They don't have names, just numbers. They don't go home with handlers. And if they go missing, they're written off." Rachel looked down at Cooper. "So what was he doing out in the middle of the ocean?" Sharon shrugged. "If he was deployed offshore, something went sideways. These dogs don't get lost. They get left." Rachel's voice dropped. "Left to die?" Sharon didn't answer right away. She stepped onto the porch, knelt beside Cooper, and gently touched the side of his neck. "See this? Scar tissue. Faint, almost healed. Looks like a microchip was removed." Rachel blinked. "Intentionally?" "Most likely. Someone didn't want him tracked." The silence that followed was heavy. Rachel stepped inside and came back with the broken metal tag she'd found tangled in his fur the first night. Sharon took it, examined the jagged edge. There was barely anything left on it but a single engraved letter, R. "He didn't tell you his name?" Sharon asked. Rachel nodded slowly. "I called him Cooper. I dreamed it, but it felt right." Sharon gave a faint smile. "Then that's who he is now." That night, Rachel lit the old lantern on the porch and sat beside Cooper, who lay stretched at her feet, tail curled over his toes. She stroked his head gently and stared into the forest. Her heart was full of questions, but her body, for the first time in years, felt still. She didn't know what kind of hell Cooper had survived, or why he was sent to sea like a ghost dog with no name. But she knew this much. Whatever he was before, he wasn't that anymore. Just 30 miles east of Wren Hollow, nestled between rows of sugar maple trees and the gentle curve of a forgotten railway line, sat the quiet town of Hollow Bend. It was the kind of place where time didn't hurry, where storefronts still had wooden signs hand-painted in faded cursive, and where neighbors paused in the street to ask about your dog, your garden, or your grief. On the corner of Willow Street, inside a narrow brick building that once housed a milliner's shop, stood the Woven Nest, a cozy craft store filled with hand-dyed yarn, driftwood mobiles, and glass jars of pressed wildflowers. Behind the counter, arranging a set of bird-shaped candle holders, stood Marianne Coble, 43 years old, pale-skinned with gentle brown eyes and wavy honey-blonde hair loosely tied back with a blue ribbon. Her frame was slim, almost delicate, though her posture carried a quiet strength like someone who had learned long ago that breaking down wasn't an option. Marianne spoke little unless asked, smiled often but sadly, and had a way of listening that made others lower their voices as if entering sacred space. There was kindness in everything she did, folding paper around a purchase, wrapping a teacup for an older customer, or offering warm tea to children who wandered in from the cold. But behind the softness was a hollow that no one dared speak about. Her son, Jacob, had vanished 4 years ago during a classified naval operation off the Pacific coast. The official report had called it an incident with probable loss at sea, but no remains were ever recovered. Jacob had just turned 23. He was tall, warm-hearted, with a boyish grin and a love for dogs so deep that even in high school, he volunteered at shelters instead of going to parties. He'd raised a yellow Labrador named Cooper, trained him with remarkable precision, and refused to let the dog be transferred to another handler when he enlisted. After Jacob's disappearance, the military returned Cooper's belongings, but not Cooper. The dog was declared reassigned to another unit. No name, no details, no closure. Marianne never believed that. She spent the first year writing letters to bases, to naval officers, to veterinary contacts. Most went unanswered. The few that did came back vague or redacted. Still, every 2 months, she sent out another letter, always handwritten, always signed, with a mother's hope. That afternoon in Hollow Bend was slow. The store was quiet except for the ticking of a wall clock and the faint music of a cello playing through an old speaker. Marianne was organizing a box of vintage postcards when the bell above the door jingled. Walt Green, a retired postal worker in his late 60s, with an unruly mustache and the knees of a man who'd walked too many miles in bad shoes, entered with a manila envelope in hand. "Afternoon, Marianne," he said with a tip of his cap. "Hi, Walt. You holding up okay in this weather?" she asked, brushing dust off her hands. "Still breathing. That's the bar these days," he replied with a crooked grin. "Got something came through Portland distribution for you. Hand-addressed. Government return address, though not official looking. No postmark." Marianne's heart stirred as she took the envelope. "Thanks, Walt." She waited until the store emptied before she opened it. The letter inside was typed, unsigned, and brief. Unconfirmed sighting of yellow Labrador matching Cooper's profile reported along the coast near Wren Hollow. No tag, no ID. Dog appears trained, responsive to tactical gestures. Unknown handler. Maybe coincidence, may not. Her hands trembled. She read it again, then again. Wren Hollow, 30 miles. A real place, a real lead. She didn't rush. Instead, she turned off the music, locked the front door, and took the long drive home through back roads. Her house, a white clapboard cottage near a creek, was lined with climbing roses and an empty dog bowl still sitting by the porch. Inside, the kitchen smelled like chamomile and dust. She sat at the table and unfolded a small wooden box that held Jacob's things, a photo of him in uniform with Cooper beside him, a worn leather collar with the name Cooper hand, pressed in brass, and a training notebook with annotations in her son's exacting print. She flipped through the notebook, page after page of commands, symbols, gestures. and on the last pagia note Jacob had written when he first got Cooper. He's not just a dog. He listens. He thinks. He chooses. If anything ever happens to me, find him. He won't stop waiting. Marianne closed the notebook and took a breath that tasted like salt. That night, she packed a small bag, tucked Jacob's photo into her purse, and left a note for her assistant at the shop. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, just that she had something important to follow. In the morning, she would drive to Wren Hollow. She didn't know what she'd find there. But hope, like grief, never needed permission. The air that morning was unnaturally still, as if the forest around Wren Hollow was holding its breath. The light filtered softly through the branches in Rachel Morgan's backyard, dappling the worn porch with shifting gold. Cooper lay beside her chair, stretched out on the planks, tail curled neatly to one side. His breathing had returned to normal, his appetite was improving, and his gaze had softened around the edges. For the first time since she found him, Rachel allowed herself to believe he might really be healing. She was sipping her second cup of coffee when the sound came. It started low, just a hum at first, then built into a heavy mechanical rumble, the kind that vibrated in the chest and made the birds scatter from the trees. Rachel knew that sound. It was a military chopper, flying lower than any civilian aircraft ever would over the valley. And Cooper knew it too. In an instant, the dog bolted upright. His entire body went rigid, tail tucked, ears flattened so hard they nearly disappeared into his skull. His eyes, once warm and uncertain, hardened into something Rachel hadn't seen before, an alertness born of survival. He took 3 steps forward, then crouched low, scanning the tree line with laser focus. "Cooper," she said gently, setting her mug down. "It's just a helicopter. You're safe." But he didn't hear her. Not really. His breathing changed short, sharp exhales, and his back legs tensed like springs. Rachel stepped toward him, slowly, hands open, but the closer she got, the more she saw it. This wasn't fear. This was muscle memory. The way his eyes swept left to right, the slight twitch in his front paw, the way he leaned into the earth, ready for a signal, a command that didn't come. And then it passed. The sound faded into the horizon. The pressure in the air broke like a wave collapsing. But Cooper didn't relax. He stood there, locked in place, as if he hadn't quite left whatever memory he'd fallen into. Rachel knelt beside him, placing a hand on his flank. His muscles were trembling. "You've been through something," she whispered. "Something deep. Something they made you forget until they didn't." She stayed with him until his breathing slowed. Later that afternoon, unable to shake what she'd witnessed, Rachel opened the old chest in her guest room, the one filled with Lucas's military gear. Inside were old notebooks, folded maps, and a binder with dog training protocols from his time working on base in San Diego. Rachel flipped through it slowly, cross-referencing hand signals, behavioral cues, even stimulus response charts. One page caught her eye. Flight-induced activation in dogs trained for rapid deployment. The symptoms matched Cooper's reaction exactly, ears pinned, crouched low, rapid scanning behavior. According to the note, the reaction could indicate prior helicopter insertion missions. Her stomach turned. She remembered Lucas once mentioning a joint program, something about asset deployment across non-civilian zones. But he never went into detail. She'd chalked it up to classified work. She now wondered if dogs like Cooper were part of that equation. Used, modified, discarded. That evening, she called Sharon Whitaker again. "Tell me about trigger responses," Rachel said before even saying hello. Sharon sighed on the other end. "He reacted to a noise?" "Chopper," Rachel replied. "Full body lockdown. Tail down, ears back, ready to engage. I've never seen anything like it." "Then he wasn't just a tactical dog," Sharon said quietly. "He was likely airborne, deployable. Only a few dogs get that kind of training. They're inserted with teams during black ops or reconnaissance, usually muzzle silent, trained to operate independently. Rachel ran her hand over Cooper's back, who now lay near the fire with his head resting on his paws. And what happens when the mission goes bad? Sharon paused. They don't usually come back. Rachel looked into the dog's amber eyes that had carried too much and said too little. Well, this one did. Meanwhile, several miles down the ridge, a small white sedan pulled onto the side of an old gravel road. The car was driven by Marianne Coble, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded a map in the passenger seat. Her GPS had long lost signal. All she had was the scrawled note with the name Rachel Morgan, Wren Hollow, and a fading photo of her son Jacob, with Cooper by his side. Marianne had changed little since her last chapter, same soft smile, same heartbreak in her voice, but now her shoulders held a quiet urgency. She'd stopped at 3 towns already, asking locals about a woman with a dog that looked military. Finally, at a gas station near a ranger's outpost, a young man with dreadlocks and a chipper voice had told her, "You might be thinking of that lady in the old cedar cabin. She's got a lab with eyes like a soldier." It was enough. Marianne spent the night at a roadside inn, bare bones. Just one room and a coffee pot, but sleep didn't come. She sat at the small wooden desk, staring at her son's handwriting in the training journal, tracing the words that had once meant the world to him. She wondered if Cooper remembered him, or if grief had rewritten them both into strangers. Back in Wren Hollow, Rachel woke sometime past midnight to find Cooper no longer at her feet. She found him in the kitchen, sitting in front of the door, alert, ears turned toward the wind like he was waiting for something she couldn't hear. Rachel whispered, "What are you listening for?" But Cooper said nothing. Because some sounds, the ones that live in bones, don't make noise at all. The morning fog hung low over Wren Hollow, weaving itself through the pine trunks like cautious ghosts. Rachel Morgan sat at the old kitchen table, a weathered laptop before her, its casing scratched and smudged from years of disuse. The machine had once belonged to her late husband, Lucas, a former Marine Corps logistics officer who had left behind a trail of files and tools that Rachel had never dared to touch, until now. Cooper lay at her feet, his head resting on her slippers, chest rising in quiet rhythm. The storm of the previous day had passed, but its residue lingered in the house, in Rachel's fingertips, in Cooper's watchful gaze, and in the hum of something unresolved between them. The helicopter incident had unsettled her deeply, and she needed answers, even if they came in pieces. She powered the laptop on. It groaned like an old man rising from a stiff chair, then blinked to life. A custom login screen with Lucas's signature passphrase appeared, Semper Victor, a subtle twist on Semper Fidelis. Rachel entered it with careful fingers. The desktop loaded slowly. Icons arranged in neat rows, tactical maps, encrypted documents, folder names and acronyms she didn't fully understand. She opened one titled, Retired Canine Protocols, Echo Projects. It required a second password. She hesitated, then typed Caleb 311. Her son's name and Lucas's old MOS. The folder opened. Inside was a single subfolder. Operation Helix Echo. She clicked it. The screen turned black. Then lines of white text began to appear, stark and clinical. Helix Echo, Experimental Deployment Program, Naval Tactical Division. Initiated 4/11/2016. Status: decommissioned. Objective: enhance nonverbal canine to human field response accuracy using visual signaling, environmental triggers, and silent adaptive conditioning. Below it, several asset logs appeared. She scrolled past roan through R6 until her eyes landed on Asset were 7, breed, Labrador Retriever, yellow, handler, redacted. Classification: Tier 2, Adaptive High Compliance. Deployment Zone. Coastal Recon, Pacific. Status: Missing in action, presumed deceased. Last recorded tag code: Re7, Coop. Rachel stared at the screen, her breath caught halfway in her throat. Coop. It wasn't just a name, it was a designation, a code. She clicked the file. A warning flashed. Classified Tier 5 clearance required. She frowned, then remembered something. She minimized the window and opened a separate folder labeled Legacy Overrides, Field Logs. Lucas had once taught her how to use an old military override sequence when they lost access during deployments. It was intended for emergencies, not espionage. But this was both. She copied the code, returned to the access prompt, and pasted it in. The file opened. Rachel's eyes skimmed the report. Her pulse pounded. There were brief logs of Cooper's trained advanced response to gesture, silence in high-stress zones, ability to act autonomously if separated from his handler. The notes described him as calm under fire, capable of making independent decisions in the absence of commands, and exceptional in field adaptability. But the final entry stopped her cold. Incident date: 7/12/2021. Summary: during a maritime recon transfer, Vessel 9 encountered unknown interference. Dog released for water extraction. Team rerouted. Tag R7 failed to return. Assumed drowned. File closed. Asset listed as terminated. Signed, Camder T. Braddock. Rachel sat back, her chest tight. They had sent him into the water, alone, and never looked back. Cooper stirred, as if sensing her tension. He lifted his head and nudged her leg gently with his nose. She turned the screen toward him. "They thought you died out there," she said softly. "But you didn't." The screen dimmed. She reached forward to close the file, but paused. One last document, tucked at the bottom of the folder. Directive, Disposal Protocols. She opened it. Note: in the event of canine asset recovery outside operational parameters, protocol dictates immediate asset retrieval and quarantine for debrief or neutralization, depending on security threat level. Rachel's blood chilled. They didn't want him found. She shut the laptop and set it aside. Her hand rested on Cooper's back, feeling the warmth of him, the solid weight of a soul not yet extinguished. He looked up at her with those golden eyes, still and knowing. For a moment, neither moved. Then came a knock at the door. Rachel rose slowly, crossing the floor with cautious steps. When she opened it, she found a woman standing there, no umbrella, no car in sight. She was around 40, with light skin and a graceful, almost fragile air. Her blonde hair was swept into a loose bun, her face pale from wind, but her eyes, those eyes burned with something deep. "Are you Rachel Morgan?" the woman asked, her voice steady but hoarse. "I am. My name's Marianne Coble," she said. I think you have my son's dog." Behind Rachel, Cooper stood in the doorway. He froze, head tilted. Marianne's hand flew to her mouth. "Cooper?" she whispered. The dog stepped forward once, then again, and for the first time in days, his tail moved not from command, not from instinct, but from recognition. The next morning broke not with sunlight, but with a thick, creeping fog that clung to the ground like a warning. Wren Hollow had gone silent. Even the birds were slow to sing. Rachel Morgan stood at the window of her kitchen, fingers wrapped around a cold mug of untouched coffee, her eyes fixed on the winding dirt road that led to her cabin. The laptop sat closed on the table behind her, the classified files from the night before still humming in her mind. Cooper sat at her feet, alert, unmoving. He hadn't taken his eyes off the door since sunrise. There was a heaviness in the air. Rachel had felt it before once, when Lucas left on his final tour, once more when the nurse had told her Caleb wouldn't wake up. Now it was back. A whisper, not of grief, but of danger. It came at 8:14 a.m. The sound of tires on gravel. Not loud but deliberate. Rachel froze. A black SUV, boxy and unmarked, pulled onto the road and stopped just outside her fence line. Two men stepped out. Both wore jeans, windbreakers, and ball-cap civilian enough to avoid suspicion, but trained eyes would catch the symmetry in their steps, the earpieces barely hidden, the way their hands hovered near their belts, though no weapons were visible. Cooper growled low and quiet. His ears went flat, and his body lowered instinctively into a crouch. Rachel dropped to one knee, placing a calming hand on his back. "Not yet," she whispered. A third man exited the vehicle, taller than the others, with a clean-shaven face, graying hair, and cold blue eyes. He moved like authority. Not military, but adjacent, like someone who spent enough time in shadows to learn how to own a room without stepping inside it. He didn't approach the cabin. He just stood by the vehicle, surveying the trees. Rachel turned quickly, grabbing her backpack from the closet. She stuffed in the laptop, a water flask, protein bars, a flashlight, and a roll of bandages. She knew this wasn't a visit. It was a retrieval or worse. She whistled low and sharp. Cooper stood instantly. Rachel pushed open the back door and slipped into the woods behind the house. The trees closed around them like old friends. The trail wasn't marked, but she knew every route and twist. It led to Lookout Station 9, an abandoned firewatch post by the Lake Oni Lucas had shown her when they were first dating. It wasn't on any map anymore, and it had two advantages: elevation and silence. They moved quickly. Rachel glanced back only once, seeing the man with the blue eyes now walking toward her front steps. She turned and pushed forward harder, heart racing. After 20 minutes of steady climbing, the forest thinned. A rusted metal tower emerged from the fog like a forgotten lighthouse, surrounded by fallen leaves and moss. The cabin at its base, used long ago by rangers, was still intact, though weathered by time. Rachel ducked inside with Cooper. The interior was musty but dry, with an old bunk, a cracked stove, and a single window facing the lake. She dropped the pack, caught her breath, and looked at Cooper. He was pacing, slow and measured, sniffing corners, checking door seams, then returning to stand beside her, tail low but steady. Rachel knelt in front of him. "I don't know who they are, but they didn't come to help." He stared at her, then sat, alert and waiting. Later that day, Rachel peeked out the window. The fog had lifted just enough for her to see movement near the ridge, too far to identify, but close enough to make her pulse spike. They had followed. She sat down on the floor, back against the wall, laptop open again. She needed to name someone she could call, someone who would know what Operation Helix Echo really meant. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed, "Michael Trent, Naval Canine Command, retired." Lucas had mentioned him once, a man who'd trained ghost dogs before walking away from the program. She found an old article in a tactical dog training forum. It listed a contact number for a training school in Northern California. She called. A man answered. Deep voice, worn but sharp. "Trent." Rachel gave her name and asked if he'd ever heard of Asset R7. Silence. Then, "Turn that dog in. Walk away now." "I'm not doing that," she replied. "You trained him?" Another pause. Then a whisper. "He wasn't meant to survive." Rachel's throat went dry. Why? Because he knew too much, learned too fast, broke protocol. He wasn't a tool anymore. He was thinking for himself. And they don't tolerate that. A rustle outside the window. Cooper rose, ears back. Rachel snapped the phone shut. Someone was out there. She reached for her flashlight. A figure moved near the tree-lined dark jacket, cap low. He didn't approach, just stood, watching. Cooper moved beside her, his body a wall of quiet power. But he didn't launch, didn't growl. He turned his head toward Rachel, waiting for her command. "Stay low," she whispered. "We wait." And he did. Because even a dog built for war could choose peace if someone gave him the choice. The light was failing over Hollow Bend as Marianne Coble sat curled on her floral-upholstered couch, the soft murmur of the radio playing forgotten classical melodies in the background. The scent of lavender from her diffuser mixed with the faint trace of old cedar that clung to her skin since returning from Wren Hollow. The meeting with Rachel, brief and heart-rending, had left her shaken but full of a cautious hope. Cooper had recognized her, not with joy, not with leaps or licks, but with a quiet, stunned presence. He had stared at her like at a dream half-remembered, and she had known, in her bones. Still, Rachel had been guarded, protective. Rightfully so. Marianne had not pushed, had not pleaded. She'd simply said, "I think I have something you'll want to see." And she did. She pulled her phone from the knitted pouch on the coffee table. Its wallpaper was a photo of her son, Jacob Coble, in uniform, grinning at the camera with one arm slung around a much younger, less battle-hardened Cooper. His brown hair had been tousled from the wind, his eyes full of mischief. It had been taken during the final week of his initial canine training in the Navy's experimental canine unit stationed at a private installation near San Diego. The same week, everything changed. She opened the video app and scrolled to the oldest clip saved. It had been uploaded from an old camcorder and transferred to her phone after Jacob disappeared. She rarely watched it, but tonight she did. The footage flickered slightly, then stabilized. Jacob stood in a sunlit clearing, a training field edged with chain-link fence and pine scrub. He wore a standard tactical vest, sleeves rolled, dust on his boots. At his side, Cooper, still young, still golden, stood tall, ears perked, eyes locked on Jacob's hand. Jacob raised his fist. Cooper sat. 2 fingers down, Cooper dropped. Jacob then stepped back 5 paces, extended his palm in a slicing motion. Cooper took off like a shot, circling a set of cones and returning to sit precisely in front of Jacob. The camera caught a laugh. Jacobson then, turning to the camera, he said, "He's smarter than I am. If anything happens to me, promise me you'll find him." Marianne paused the video. She had watched it dozens of times, but it still made her hands tremble. Her son had known something even then. She didn't believe in omens, but she believed in intuition. And his final words were not said as a joke. Her phone buzzed suddenly. A text. Unknown number. No name. 1 image attached. She opened it. The photo was grainy, taken from a distance, probably with a zoom lens. It showed a lakeside clearing framed by evergreens. On the left, a woman with auburn hair, crouched beside a large yellow dog. On the right, the dog's head turned, not toward the woman, but toward the woods, alert. The timestamp on the corner was that morning. Her pulse quickened. The lake recognized the shape of the trees, the slope of the hill in the background. Lookout Lake. She didn't reply to the message, didn't ask who had sent it. She simply stood, grabbed her coat, and walked out into the night. Marianne's Karan old silver Toyota, with a cracked dashboard and one missing hubcap, rattled slightly as she turned off the main road and into the narrowing forest trail. She knew these woods by memory now, knew how to let the silence guide her. When the road ended, she stepped out and continued on foot, flashlight in hand, boots crunching softly against pine needles and dry earth. Half a mile in, the tree line broke into a clearing. A thin path twisted upward toward a structure just barely visible against the starlit sky. Lookout Station 9. She took a breath and climbed. At the top, a soft flicker of firelight escaped through a crack in the boarded window. Inside, Rachel sat cross-legged near a small gas lantern, her face tense and tired. Cooper lay beside her, his head resting on his paws, ears angled slightly toward the door. Rachel stood when she heard the knock. She opened the door with hesitation, her hand tucked behind her back, clutching a heavy flashlight like a weapon. Marianne stepped into the lantern glow, both hands raised. "It's just me." Rachel relaxed only slightly. "How did you find us?" Marianne didn't answer. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and handed it over. Rachel glanced at the image. Her eyes widened. "Where did this come from?" "Does it matter?" Marianne's voice cracked softly. "You need to see what I have." She tapped the screen and opened the video. Rachel watched, silent, expression unreadable. But Cooper moved. The moment Jacob's voice came through the speaker, Cooper lifted his head. When the voice said his name, "Cooper, stay," his ears perked fully. He stood slowly and walked toward the phone, his eyes locked on the screen. He let out a sound Rachel had never heard from him before. Not a bark, not a whimper. Something in between. A memory-made sound. Rachel looked at Marianne. "You're sure?" she asked, even though the truth was already in the air between them. Marianne nodded, swallowing hard. "He was my son's. And now, he's yours too." The night was colder than it had been in weeks. Wind stirred the tall pine trees around Lookout Station 9, rattling old window frames and brushing leaves across the rooftop like whispers from the past. Inside, the lantern had burned low, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. Marianne had fallen asleep on the old cot, one hand still resting on her phone, as if afraid the memory of her son might slip away if she let go. Rachel sat awake by the window, eyes fixed on the tree line. Cooper lay beside her, his head on his paws but not asleep. His ears twitched every so often, always listening, always calculating. They both felt it before it came, the shift in the wind, the subtle silence that replaced the rustling trees, a presence. Rachel stood and moved quietly to the door. She peeked out. Down the hill, barely visible through the branches, headlights cut through the darkness. The black SUV. It had found them again. Her pulse quickened. She turned to Cooper, kneeling beside him. "It's time," she whispered. "We might have to run." Cooper stood, body tense, but silent. He didn't whine. He didn't growl. He waited. Marianne stirred. "What is it?" "They found us." Rachel grabbed the backpack, stuffed in the laptop and her flashlight. "We go down the back slope. There's a wash that leads to a trailhead. It'll take us away from the lake." But before they could move, a sound rang out high-pitched and precise, like a sharp whistle buried under a layer of static. It came from just outside the cabin. Cooper froze. Rachel watched in horror as his body stiffened, his ears flattened, his tail tucked. He lowered himself to the floor, trembling. His eyes lost their focus, caught in something internala command deeper than memory. "No," Rachel whispered. She reached out, touching his face gently. "Look at me." Cooper didn't blink. His muscles tensed, as if awaiting orders. Then, a voice called from outside. Calm, commanding, male. "Asset R7, return." Rachel stood and opened the cabin door slowly. 3 men stood just beyond the clearing. 2 wore windbreakers, boots, and caps low over their eye civilian in appearance, but postured like military. The third, taller and older, stood in the center. His name was Nathan Rourke, a former intelligence operative with steel-gray hair, a soldier's jaw, and the gaze of a man who expected obedience. Rourke's gloved hand held a small device with blinking blue lights, the source of the signal. "I don't want trouble," he said, "but that dog doesn't belong to you. He's classified property. Hand him over and we'll walk away." Rachel stepped outside, shutting the door behind her. He's not property. He's a survivor. Rourke raised an eyebrow. He's dangerous. He's compromised. No, she said. He's healing. Inside the cabin, Marianne had placed herself in front of Cooper. She whispered his name over and over, her voice soft, maternal, anchored in Lavenant control. Outside, Rourke pressed a button on the device. A sharp pulse hummed again, and Cooper howled. A guttural, wrenching sound tore from his chest. He staggered forward, pushing against the door, body pulled by something ancient, something trained. His legs shook, his breath grew ragged. Rachel opened the door, standing in his way. Don't. He stopped. Torn. Rourke stepped forward, voice hardening. Return to handler. Asset R7 engage. Cooper's body jerked, his eyes glazed. He took a step forward. But then Marianne spoke. Cooper, she said, steady and warm, her voice trembling but fierce. Stay. And then Rachel added softly, You don't have to go. You choose now. Cooper's body shook. Then he turned not toward the voice that commanded him, but toward the women who loved him. His eyes cleared, his ears rose, and with a sudden snarl, he launched forward not to obey, but to defend. He slammed into Rourke with a full-body strike, knocking the device from his hand. The two agents reached for weapons, but Cooper spun with precision, jaws bared, body blocking their line of sight. Rachel grabbed Marianne and pulled her down the trail behind the cabin. Cooper turned back to them, then followed, his stride purposeful and unchained. Behind them, Rourke struggled to his feet, stunned. But he didn't pursue, because in that moment he knew the asset was gone, and a soul had taken its place. The sun dipped low over Clearwater Bay, casting the sky in hues of bronze and soft lavender. A new house stood quietly at the edge of the pines, modest, cedar-paneled, with a wide porch and a red-painted mailbox that read, Morgan and Coble. Wind chimes whispered gently beside the door. Inside, the scent of rosemary and fresh wood filled the air. It had been 3 months since the last confrontation, since Cooper made his choice, since they all walked away from a past that never truly wanted them whole. Now they were rebuilding. The house had once been an abandoned ranger cabin, a forgotten structure near the southern bend of the lake. Together, Rachel Morgan and Marianne Coble had spent weeks restoring it, tearing out rot, patching walls, redoing the roof. Rachel, 38, her auburn hair now streaked with silver at the temples, found purpose in the labor. Her hands, once familiar with camera lenses and notebooks, grew strong with hammers and soil. Marianne, graceful and quietly resilient, brought warmth in her way embroidering curtains, tending a small herb garden, writing letters she never sent. And Cooper, he was the soul of it all. The yellow Labrador moved with a different rhythm now. He was still lean and powerful, his coat catching the light like golden wheat. But his gaze had softened. His steps, though still alert, carried no edge of fear. The only trace of his past surfaced in fleeting moments when a helicopter passed too low, or a metallic clang echoed from the woods. In those moments, he would pause, ears twitching, body still, but the tremble was gone. Because now, when the noise came, he was not alone. A collar rested snugly around his neck, aged brown leather with a new brass tag. It read, Cooper, not a tool. Family. Rachel had engraved it herself, using Lucas's old gear from the attic, hands shaking with every letter. One evening, a new visitor arrived. Sarah Wilkes, a local schoolteacher in her early 50s with round glasses, sandy hair in a ponytail, and a gentle bird-like voice, came by to drop off a crate of children's books and dog treats. She had heard the rumors about the dog who once belonged to a lost soldier. Her students had made cards for Cooper-colored paw prints, stick figures of him playing fetch, one bold drawing of him wearing sunglasses with the words, "Hero Dog." Rachel smiled and thanked her. Cooper, as if sensing Sarah's warmth, let her scratch behind his ears. "He's calmer than I expected," Sarah said, crouching. "Most rescues, they never forget." Rachel looked down at Cooper. "He hasn't forgotten," she said quietly. "He just remembers better now." That night, Rachel and Marianne sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, mugs of tea in hand. The air was crisp with the promise of fall. Cooper lay between them, stretched across the wooden boards, his head resting on Rachel's foot. His breathing was slow, even. "I still write to him," Marianne said softly. Rachel turned. "Jacob?" Marianne nodded. "Not real letters, just thoughts, like if he could read them somewhere. If Cooper carries something back to him, in his sleep." Rachel didn't speak for a long time. Then, "He does. I think he remembers Jacob not just in fear, but in love." They watched the stars for a while. And then, something beautiful happened. Cooper rolled onto his side, paws twitching lightly, a low, gentle huff escaping his throat. He was dreaming. But this time, he didn't whimper. He didn't jolt awake. He didn't bolt for the shadows. He slept, unbroken, whole,